The hills of Bethlehem stretch beneath the sun, rolling fields of olive trees and grazing sheep, a place where time itself seems to move slowly. Among these hills, in a family of farmers and shepherds, a boy tended his flock with a heart full of courage and a spirit untouched by fear. His name was David, the youngest son of Jesse, a child overlooked by men but destined for greatness in the eyes of God. While his older brothers carried themselves with the strength and bearing of soldiers, David carried a sling, a staff, and a harp, wandering the fields with melodies on his lips and vigilance in his eyes. He was not born into power or privilege, but into obscurity, where lions and bears roamed the wilderness and every day demanded courage from even the smallest shepherd. Night after night, he would look to the heavens, the stars glittering above the fields, and sing psalms of wonder and faith. His words rose into the silence like offerings carried on the wind. These songs revealed a soul deeply anchored in something greater than himself. Though he was only a boy, he saw the hand of the Creator in every blade of grass, every gust of wind, every living thing entrusted to his care. When predators struck, David did not cower. He fought with the resolve of one who knew that protecting his flock was more than duty. It was a calling. He tore lions from his sheep, struck down bears with his staff, and trained his hands for battle without realizing he was preparing for a destiny that would change the course of a nation. Far from the hills of Bethlehem, Israel was trembling. The Philistines pressed harder against its borders. The tribes of Israel, once united under leaders like Joshua and the judges, had fractured into factions of fear. Saul, the first king, stood tall among his people, but his heart faltered under the weight of leadership. He had been chosen by God, yet his disobedience cost him divine favor. In the shadows of Saul's palace, whispers spread of God's decision. The throne would pass to another, a man not of Saul's line, a man after God's own heart. One day a prophet came to Bethlehem. His name was Samuel, the last of Israel's judges and the voice of the Lord in a time of turmoil. Samuel carried with him a secret mission, one that could not be spoken aloud for fear of Saul's wrath. The Lord had commanded him to anoint a new king, and his steps led him to the house of Jesse. The family gathered, and one by one Jesse's sons stood before the prophet. Each appeared strong, tall, fit for battle, but with each Samuel shook his head. "The Lord has not chosen this one," he said, as Jesse's pride slowly dimmed. When the last of the brothers had passed, confusion lingered. Samuel asked if there were any others, and Jesse, almost as an afterthought, admitted, "There is still the youngest. He is tending the sheep." They sent for him, and David came running in from the fields, sunburned, hair tousled, clothes smelling of the pasture. He was small compared to his brothers, but his eyes burned with life, and his heart bore a strength unseen. As he entered, Samuel felt the divine whisper in his soul, "This is the one." He raised the horn of oil and poured it over David's head. In that moment, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon the shepherd boy, anointing him for a destiny he could not yet imagine. Around him his brothers stood stunned, the oil dripping down his face and beard, marking him as chosen. A boy ignored by men had been selected by God to one day rule a nation, yet after that day nothing seemed to change. David returned to the fields, harp in hand, sling by his side, watching the sheep as he had always done. But within him a fire had been lit. Though he still wandered the pastures, his destiny now stretched far beyond them. Across the land, Saul's reign grew heavier, clouded by disobedience and an unsettling spirit that troubled his nights. His servants, desperate to ease the king's torment, spoke of a young shepherd in Bethlehem, a skilled musician whose harp could soothe even the most restless soul. David was summoned, and before long the boy who sang under the stars stood in the halls of Israel's king. When David played, peace returned to Saul, and the boy from Bethlehem became not only a servant of the crown, but the secret balm to the heart of a troubled ruler. Time passed, and Saul's struggles deepened, while David's life continued to weave itself into the fabric of Israel's fate. He had not yet lifted a sword in war, but his courage was already being forged in unseen ways. The fields of Bethlehem had trained his eyes to watch, his hands to strike with precision, and his heart to trust in the Lord above all else. Every bear defeated, every song sung beneath the stars, every moment of faith in solitude had been a rehearsal for what was to come. Soon the quiet shepherd would be called to stand on a battlefield where the future of his people hung in the balance, and the world would know his name. The winds of war swept once more across Israel. From the coastal plains the Philistines marched, their armies bold and relentless, pushing inland with iron weapons and towering champions. They gathered in the valley of Elah, their encampment stretching across the hills like a sea of shields and spears. Opposite them, the Israelites took their positions, weary and fearful, their king among them. But their courage drained by the sight of one man who stepped forward each day to issue his challenge. He was a giant, a man named Goliath of Gath, a warrior of immense stature and greater pride. His frame loomed nearly 10 feet tall, clad in bronze armor that glistened in the sun, scales upon scales of metal that made him seem like a living fortress. A massive spear rested in his hand, its shaft like a weaver's beam, its head tipped with iron heavy enough to fell an ox. Each morning and each evening he would stride into the valley, voice echoing between the hills. "Choose a man among you," he bellowed, "and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will be your servants. But if I prevail, you shall be ours." Day after day his words mocked Israel, and each time silence followed. The warriors of Saul looked at one another, but none dared step forward. Even the king, whose shoulders once stood above the rest, shrank back, his heart paralyzed by fear. For 40 days the challenge rang out, and for 40 days Israel trembled. Then one morning, a young shepherd boy arrived at the camp, sent by his father with bread and grain for his brothers. David walked among the soldiers, his eyes wide at the sight of the battlefield, the clash of armor, the nervous murmurs of men too afraid to fight. He heard the giant's voice thunder once more across the valley, and he watched as hardened warriors shrank from the sound. Something in David stirred. Anger, not at the size of the enemy, but at the insult hurled against his people and against the living God they served. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," David asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The men laughed at him. Some scoffed at his youth, his lack of armor, his inexperience. Even his brothers scolded him, accusing him of arrogance and curiosity. But David's words spread until they reached the ears of the king himself. Saul summoned the boy, and David stood before him, unafraid. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," he said. "Your servant will go and fight him." The king looked at him with disbelief. "You are not able to go against this Philistine," Saul replied. "You are only a youth, and he has been a warrior from his youth." But David's eyes did not waver. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," he said, "and when a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul, desperate for a champion, relented. "Go," he said, "and the Lord be with you." They placed armor upon David, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail, but the weight of it burdened him, the unfamiliar clank of metal restricting his steps. He shook his head, removed the armor, and stood once more as he had been in the pastures, with a staff, a sling, and faith. As he walked toward the brook, the Philistine army jeered, mocking the boy who dared step forward. David bent down, his hand reaching into the water, selecting 5 smooth stones. He placed them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, gripping his sling as though it were an extension of his arm. Across the valley the giant watched him come closer, laughter rumbling in his chest. He strode forward with his shield-bearer, his armor clanking like thunder. "Am I a dog," Goliath sneered, "that you come at me with sticks?" He cursed David by his gods, his voice a storm of disdain. "Come here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But David's voice rose clear and strong, carrying across the valley with words that would echo for generations. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. The whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." The giant advanced, footsteps pounding the earth, and David ran quickly toward the battle line. His hand reached into his pouch, pulled out a stone and placed it in his sling. The cords whirled above his head faster and faster until he released. The stone cut through the air, guided not by strength alone but by faith. It struck the giant on the forehead, and the sound echoed like the crack of thunder. Goliath's eyes widened in shock as his massive frame faltered, then collapsed forward into the dust with a crash that silenced the valley. David ran forward, stood over him, seized the giant's own sword, and with one swift stroke severed his head. The Philistine army gasped in terror, their invincible champion lying dead at the feet of a shepherd boy. Panic spread and they fled, while Israel's soldiers surged forward with a cry of triumph. The shepherd who had once fought lions and bears in the wilderness had now slain a giant before nations. The fields of Bethlehem had given Israel its champion. Word spread quickly throughout the land, and songs rose in David's honor. The women of Israel sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." The boy who came with bread now returned with glory. The youth who tended sheep now stood as a warrior whose name was on every tongue. But glory is never without its shadow. The songs that lifted David also pierced Saul's heart with jealousy. A seed of suspicion took root in the king's mind, and what began as admiration would soon twist into fear, envy, and hatred. David had defeated Goliath, but his greatest battles were yet to come. Battles not only against armies and enemies, but against betrayal, exile, and the heavy cost of a destiny ordained by God. The sound of songs echoing through Israel should have been a comfort to the king, but each refrain stung like an arrow to Saul's heart. The words of the women praising David spread through the streets, their voices bright and unrestrained. Saul had been chosen by God, anointed as Israel's first king, yet now his throne felt fragile beneath him. He had watched the shepherd boy rise from obscurity to slay the Philistine giant, and instead of joy he felt fear. "What more can he have but the kingdom?" Saul muttered to himself, bitterness gnawing at his soul. From that day his eyes never left David, suspicion lurking in every glance. At first Saul drew David close, giving him command over men, sending him into battle after battle. And each time David returned victorious, the people's love for him deepened. His wisdom on the field matched his courage, and his humility made him beloved, even among Saul's servants. Yet the king's heart darkened further with each cheer that greeted David's name. Jealousy became rage, and rage bred violence. Twice, as David played the harp to soothe the king's restless spirit, Saul hurled his spear, the weapon thudding into the wall where David's body had been moments before. David slipped away, but he knew the king's intent was no longer hidden. Saul wanted him dead. David's life became a shadow of constant flight. By day he fought battles for the nation he loved. By night he hid from the very king he served. Yet in the darkness of Saul's jealousy, David found a bond that shone like light: his friendship with Jonathan, the king's own son. Jonathan loved David as his own soul. He saw in him the courage, faith, and humility that his father lacked, and he made a covenant with him, pledging loyalty that defied blood and throne. "Whatever you desire, I will do for you," Jonathan told him, and he gave David his robe, his sword, his bow, his very armor, symbols of a prince offering his inheritance to another. The two wept together, knowing that loyalty to each other would demand a price, for Jonathan's love for David stood in direct opposition to his father's wrath. Saul's attempts to kill David grew relentless. Soldiers searched for him. Spies reported his movements, and David's life became one of constant escape. From the palace he fled, from the cities he disappeared, until finally he found refuge in the wilderness, the caves of Adullam, his shelter. There, others came to him, the outcasts, the discontented, the broken. From them David forged a band of warriors loyal not to Saul, but to him. They were rough men, hardened by life. Yet under David's leadership they became a force bound by loyalty and courage. Even in hiding, David became what Saul feared most, a leader loved by the people. Twice, Saul's life fell into David's hands, and twice David spared him. Once in the cave of En-Gedi, Saul entered unknowing that David and his men hid deep inside. David's men urged him to strike, but he crept silently and only cut off a piece of the king's robe. When Saul left, David called out after him, bowing low. "My lord the king," he cried, "see this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut the corner of your cloak but did not kill you. There is nothing in my hand against you. Why do you pursue me?" Saul wept, torn between shame and fury, confessing for a moment that David was more righteous than he, yet never releasing the hatred that consumed him. Again, on another night, David entered Saul's camp while the king slept. His spear lay by his head, his men slumbering around him. Abishai, one of David's fiercest warriors, whispered, "Let me strike him with the spear, and I will not need to strike twice." But David shook his head. "Do not destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord himself will strike him." He took Saul's spear and water jug, retreated to the hillside, and once more called out to the king, showing that he could have ended his life but chose mercy. Saul's voice trembled as he called back, "I have sinned. Return, my son David." Yet David knew the words were empty. Trust between them was shattered, and he could never return. The years of exile tested him. He wandered from stronghold to stronghold, lived among Philistines as a mercenary, and fought battles for survival rather than glory. His songs changed, filled with longing and grief, yet always echoing faith in God's deliverance. In caves and deserts he poured out his heart in psalms that would endure through centuries, words of lament, of trust, of desperate cries and steadfast hope. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" His faith, tested in solitude, grew deeper than ever, preparing him for the throne that still lay ahead. Meanwhile, Saul's madness consumed him. His pursuit of David was relentless, and yet his kingdom crumbled around him. Enemies pressed harder, and the Philistines grew bolder, their armies stronger. Saul's jealousy had blinded him to the true threat, his spear aimed at his own champion, while the nation's enemies gathered strength. His tragic path led him to a dark night on Mount Gilboa, where Israel's army faltered before the Philistines. Wounded and surrounded, Saul fell upon his own sword, ending his reign in despair. Jonathan too lay slain upon the battlefield, the bond between him and David severed by death's cruel hand. When news reached David, his heart shattered. He tore his clothes and wept aloud, composing a lament that mourned both friend and foe. "How the mighty have fallen," he cried. "O Jonathan, you were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. The fugitives' years were over, but they had forged a king." From caves and exile, from betrayal and tears, David emerged tempered, humbled, and prepared. He had spared the one who sought his life, endured loss and grief, and learned that true strength lay not in the sword, but in the hand of the Lord. Now, with Saul gone, the path lay open, the shepherd, the giant slayer, the outlaw, that he would become king. But his battles were not finished, and his reign would demand victories greater than any he had yet known. After Saul's death, the kingdom lay fractured, torn between loyalty to the fallen king Eshouse and hope in the shepherd warrior whose name had become legend. For 7 years David reigned in Hebron, ruling Judah, while Saul's son clung to the northern tribes. The land simmered with conflict, families divided, loyalties tested, until at last the house of Saul weakened and the tribes turned their hearts toward David. Leaders gathered, elders spoke, and voices rose as one. "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, even while Saul was king, you led Israel in battle. And the Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler.' They anointed him king, and for the first time, all Israel stood united under David's crown. With his anointing came a vision greater than tribal survival. He set his eyes upon a city that stood as both prize and fortress, Jerusalem, stronghold of the Jebusites, unconquered though it lay in the very heart of the land. Its walls loomed, its gates mocked those who approached. Yet David marched, his warriors scaling the defenses, breaking through the stronghold. The city fell, and David claimed it as his capital, the city of David, the center from which he would rule a united kingdom. From Jerusalem, Israel's influence spread outward, a beacon of strength rising where once division had reigned. The Philistines, alarmed by his rise, struck swiftly. Twice they gathered their armies in the valley of Rephaim, confident that their iron weapons and seasoned warriors would crush him as they had crushed Saul. But David did not trust in numbers or in strength of arms. He sought the counsel of the Lord. Each time he was given strategy, Each time his faith turned the tide. In one battle, his men broke through like water bursting from a dam, overwhelming the Philistines. In another, David was told to circle behind, to wait until the sound of marching echoed through the tops of the balsam trees, the sign that the Lord himself went before them. At the signal, David advanced, and victory was complete. The Philistines, who had once struck fear into Israel, were driven back, their stronghold shattered. From that moment, David's reign expanded with relentless force. He subdued Moab to the east, striking down their warriors. To the north he defeated Hadadezer of Zobah, extending Israel's reach as far as the Euphrates. The Arameans came against him and were crushed. Edom fell under his control. Ammon, Amalek, and countless others bowed before the strength of his armies. Wherever he marched, the Lord gave him victory, and his fame spread like fire across the nations. Tribute poured into Jerusalem, gold and silver from conquered cities, treasures dedicated to the God of Israel. The shepherd who once carried a sling now commanded armies that reshaped the map of the Near East. But David was more than a conqueror. He longed to unite his people not only by sword and crown, but by faith. The Ark of the Covenant, symbol of God's presence, had long been absent from the heart of the nation. David resolved to bring it to Jerusalem, to make the city not only the seat of his throne but the dwelling place of the Lord. With singing and dancing, with shouts and trumpets, he led the procession. The ark entered the city, and David, clothed in a linen ephod, danced before the Lord with all his might. His joy was unrestrained, his worship unashamed. To some it seemed undignified, even scandalous, but to David it was the only response fitting for the God who had lifted him from shepherd boy to king. "I will celebrate before the Lord," he declared. "I will become even more undignified than this." And the city rejoiced, for the presence of God had come to dwell in their midst. In the height of his reign, David dreamed of building a house, a temple for the Lord. He lived in a palace of cedar while the ark rested within a tent, and his heart longed to build something greater. Yet the word of the Lord came to him through the prophet Nathan. "You are not the one to build me a house. Instead, I will make you a house. Your throne will be established forever." It was not David who would build the temple, but his son. Yet God promised him a legacy beyond stone and cedar, a dynasty that would endure through generations, a line that would stretch beyond kings and kingdoms into eternity itself. David ruled with justice, with wisdom, and with vision. He gathered mighty men around him, warriors whose deeds became legend, men who faced hundreds alone in battle, who leapt into pits to slay lions, who stood when others fled. His court became the heart of a nation, his psalms the soul of a people. He wrote of green pastures and still waters, of the Lord as shepherd and refuge. He composed songs of victory and laments of sorrow, prayers whispered in caves now sung in palaces. His voice gave Israel a language of worship. His heart gave them a vision of God's kingship beyond any throne on earth. Under his reign, Israel reached its zenith. From the river to the sea, from desert to mountain, the land knew peace and prosperity. Neighboring kings sent tribute, alliances were formed, and enemies trembled. The shepherd boy of Bethlehem had become the warrior king of Israel, his life a testament to courage, faith, and unyielding trust in the Lord. Yet in the midst of triumph, shadows lingered. For no man, however great, is beyond weakness, and David's heart, once pure and steadfast, would soon falter. His crown, won through faith and perseverance, would be tested not only by enemies outside his walls, but by the desires and failings within. The days of triumph stretched on, and the crown of Israel glittered upon David's brow. Victories stacked one upon another, his kingdom secure, his armies feared, his palace filled with splendor. Yet it was not the sword of an enemy, nor the might of a foreign king that threatened him now, but the quiet temptations of power. For it was in a season when kings went out to war that David remained behind in Jerusalem. From the rooftop of his palace he gazed across the city, and there he saw a woman bathing, her beauty radiant in the moonlight. Desire stirred in him, and instead of turning away, he summoned her. Her name was Bathsheba, wife of Uriah, one of his most loyal warriors. That night a decision was made that would stain his reign forever. What began in secrecy could not remain hidden. Bathsheba conceived, and fear gripped the king who had never trembled before armies. To cover his sin, he recalled Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would go to his home and to his wife. But Uriah, loyal to his fellow soldiers still in tents, refused to take comfort while others fought. Twice he resisted, and David's desperation grew. At last he penned a letter, sealed it, and placed it in Uriah's hand, a letter carrying his own death sentence. Uriah returned to the front, and by David's order he was placed where the fighting was fiercest, then abandoned. He fell beneath enemy blades, his loyalty repaid with betrayal. When Bathsheba's mourning was over, David took her as his wife, and for a moment he believed the matter buried. But the eyes of the Lord see what men conceal. The prophet Nathan came before the king with a story. There were 2 men in a city, he said, one rich and one poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, it grew up with him and his children, ate from his food, drank from his cup, slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Then a traveler came to the rich man, but instead of taking from his own flock, he took the poor man's lamb, killed it, and prepared it for his guest. As David listened, his anger flared. "As surely as the Lord lives," he declared, "the man who did this must die. He must pay 4-fold for the lamb, because he did this thing and had no pity." Nathan's voice struck like thunder. "You are the man." The words fell upon David with crushing weight. The prophet laid bare his sin, the adultery, the murder, the despising of the Lord's command. "The sword will never depart from your house," Nathan warned. "What you did in secret, the Lord will do before all Israel." David's heart broke. Unlike Saul, who justified and resisted, David confessed. He fasted, he wept, he poured out psalms of anguish. "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin." His cries did not undo the consequences. The child born to Bathsheba died, and grief weighed heavily upon him. His house, once united, became divided. The words of Nathan proved true. The sword rose within his own family. Among his sons, Absalom stood tall, handsome, charming, beloved by many. But ambition burned in him, and resentment smoldered. His sister Tamar had been wronged by their brother Amnon, and David's failure to act poisoned Absalom's heart. He avenged Tamar by killing Amnon, then fled into exile. Years later he returned, but the bond between father and son was fractured. Slowly Absalom stole the hearts of Israel, standing at the city gates, flattering, promising, whispering that justice would be his, if only he were king. At last his rebellion erupted. He marched into Jerusalem, his forces vast, and David, unwilling to see the city destroyed, fled once more into exile. Old wounds reopened, and the weight of sin and sorrow pressed heavily upon him. Yet even in exile, David's faith endured. He prayed, he strategized, and his loyal men remained by his side. Battles were fought, plans unraveled, and Absalom's rebellion reached its tragic end. In the forest of Ephraim, Absalom's long hair caught in the branches of an oak tree as his mule passed beneath. Suspended, helpless, he was found by David's men. Despite the king's command to spare his son Joab, David's commander struck him down. Word reached David, and grief swallowed him whole. "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." The cry of the warrior king echoed through the halls of his palace, a lament of a father broken by the consequences of his own failings. Though restored to his throne, David's later years were marked by both triumph and turmoil. He defeated further enemies, secured his borders, and prepared for the future, yet his family bore scars of betrayal and bloodshed. In his old age, frailty came upon him, and he leaned on those around him for strength. Bathsheba remained by his side, and from their union came Solomon, the son who would succeed him. David gathered materials for the temple he would never build, instructing Solomon to rise to the task. He blessed him, charging him to walk in the ways of the Lord, to be strong, to keep the commandments, to rule with justice. As David's life drew to its close, he reflected on the path that had carried him from shepherds' fields to royal palaces. His voice lingered in psalms that captured every season of his soul: joy and despair, triumph and repentance, cries of anguish and songs of praise. He had slain giants, united tribes, built a kingdom, and penned poetry that would outlive empires. Yet his greatest legacy was not the crown upon his head, nor the victories of his armies. Generations would remember him as Israel's greatest king, not because he was flawless, but because he was a man after God's own heart. And so the shepherd who became king breathed his last leaving behind a throne that would endure through his descendants, a promise spoken by God himself, that one day from his line would come a ruler greater than any the world had known. His reign ended, but his legacy had only begun. The Psalms of David continued to rise in worship, the story of his life etched into history, his name forever bound to courage, repentance, and faith. He was a warrior who fought giants, a poet who sang of God's greatness, a king who forged a nation, and a man whose heart, though broken and flawed, always returned to the Lord. The story of David does not end with his death, nor with the passing of his crown to Solomon. His life, woven with triumph and tragedy, became a tapestry that spoke to every generation after him. He was the shepherd who trusted God against lions and bears, the warrior who stood fearless before giants, the fugitive who clung to faith in caves and wilderness, the king who united tribes and nations, the sinner who stumbled, and the poet who poured out his soul in songs that still rise from the hearts of the faithful. His life was never a straight path of unbroken glory, but a journey of stumbling and rising, failing and returning, sin and redemption. In David, humanity saw both its weakness and its hope, that even in brokenness one could find the mercy of God. His crown was forged not by inheritance nor ambition, but by faith and obedience. He conquered enemies, yes, but greater still, he showed that true strength was not in the sword, but in the heart yielded to the Lord. His reign transformed Israel from scattered tribes into a kingdom whose influence reached far beyond its borders, a kingdom whose capital, Jerusalem, became the city of God, the heart of a people, the center of worship. His psalms gave Israel its voice, words of praise and lament that stretched from green pastures to shadowed valleys, from exaltation to despair, yet always returned to the unwavering truth that the Lord is faithful. But perhaps the greatest mark of David's life was not what he built, but what he pointed toward. God's promise to him was not only for his throne or his descendants, but for a kingdom without end. From his line would come one greater, a king whose reign would not be broken by sin, nor limited by death, nor bound by the borders of Israel. David's life, for all its victories and failures, became the foundation of a greater hope, a shadow of the eternal king to come. Through David, the world was given a glimpse of God's plan, that redemption and kingship, mercy and justice could be joined in one line, one promise, one Messiah. As the centuries passed, nations rose and fell, empires conquered and crumbled, but the name of David remained. His psalms continued to shape worship, his story continued to inspire courage, his legacy continued to remind men and women alike that greatness is not measured by perfection, but by faith. To this day, when people speak of kingship, of courage, of worship, they remember David, the shepherd of Bethlehem, who became the warrior king of Israel. He was a man who knew both victory and defeat, joy and sorrow, sin and forgiveness, a man after God's own heart. And though he lies in the dust of ages, his life still speaks, calling us to courage in the face of giants, to repentance in the face of failure, and to faith in the God who lifts the lowly and crowns them with purpose. David's story is more than history. It is a song of trust, of struggle, of mercy, and of hope, a song that echoes across the centuries, reminding us that even the greatest of kings are but men, and that true greatness belongs to the one who reigns forever.